Hello and welcome to the Auto Limits channel, where we are continuing our odyssey belatedly continuing our odyssey into the films of Sam Fuller. This week, this time, we're watching The Big Red One in our quest to gain a fuller understanding.
Hey,
That's about
there we
right.
go.
It's been so long, I can't remember. I can't remember how we usually introduce these. Anyway,
Yeah, it was like 3 months back we watched the last one. I think we've both just had a lot on, but we've been excited to tackle the big red one for a long time, pretty much since we started Fuller Understanding. We've wanted to get here because it seems to be in many ways. There's a few films after this. I know. White Dog is one that's kind of more widely seen than some of the others, but other than that, it's sort of peters out. This is like the apex, isn't it? And it feels like this is like, without kind of putting the cart before the horse and talking about my opinion on the film or anything too early, like um this is the culmination of so many themes and ideas that were from the beginning of his work as well. So yeah, maybe I don't know if you want to start.
yeah, I think you're right, and also in a lot of ways, this is the film that. This is also the starting point of his film careers in a lot of way. Like before the film's based entirely on his experiences through World War II, joining the infantry at the age of 31, day after Pearl Harbor, when the average age of an infantryman was 19. He was already a seasoned reporter, published author, written a couple of scripts, but he wasn't fully on his way yet. I think, as we covered in some of the earlier episodes. But throughout his experience in the campaign, he's gathering stories, keeping notes, and starting to think about this whole thing as a book or as a film, and sort of this is the film that he kind of wants to make, even while he's already even while he's still fighting the war. This idea is forming in his head, and in a lot of ways this film becomes the whole impetus for his career. Like every decision that he makes is, career wise, he's looking to make the big red one, and kind of missing opportunities or turning down different opportunities at various points because it's not doesn't feel like it's the right time or it's the right opportunity, or some external factor gets in the way of him making this film. We didn't watch it for this, so I think we're going to watch it maybe for a later, but there is also like a TV series that happens in the 50s called Dogface, which is almost like an episodic version of this that he works on as well. But for Sam Fuller, this film is a long time coming.
Yeah,
um,
and it's interesting because I know from some of our earlier episodes, like you just say, like how much he was obviously aiming to make this his whole career, how much this is sort of what he was, he kind of had this one in the drawer the whole time. I know you've gone through his autobiography and watched some documentary footage. Did the version of it that came out, did the film he managed to make live up to what you wanted it to be? I know, just to preface for the audience, we watched the reconstructed cut, which is the 160-minute version, not the kind of 2 hour version. What was his opinion on how it turned out, the movie?
well, I mean, we'll preface this by saying, like, Sam Fuller never saw this version. Like, it was
Yeah.
made 6 years after his death. So Sam Fuller dies in '96. This film's made in 2003, 2004, premieres at Cannes. It's basically a lot of kind of enthusiasts, and Sam Fuller, towards the end of his career, like after already being championed by um, uh, Spielberg and Scorsese, like he started to be championed by Jim Jarmusch and Quentin Tarantino right at the sort of height of their '90s popularity. So there's this kind of spotlight that's put back on it just before his death, and then what basically happens is, he's been talking to all these people about this, and it becomes a bit of a legend amongst the filmmakers. Some of this footage shows up in like a teaser trailer thing with all these scenes that aren't in the final film, and people start to get interested in finding these other cans, and they get hold of the footage and reconstruct it, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the version that Sam Fuller saw was the 153-minute theatrical cut that had been taken from his hands, recut, stripped down for commercial reasons. 2 hours is better than 3 hours in terms of screenings in a cinema per day. So he's sort of deeply disappointed by it, but at the same time, he's also very grateful that a version of his film is released to the wider world. So it's interesting, like the reconstructions, it's called the sort of 3 hour cut or best part of 3 hour cut is not really. It's not a director's cut as such, but they've kind of gone from the original script and pulled it back together that way. So what we see is I mean, what we see is yeah, it's like a augmented version of his original film. So it's it's difficult. It's quite interesting, really. Like we have often talked about his films being compromised in some way, shape, or another. Often the endings are changed and things like that. So I don't know. It seems strangely appropriate to be watching something that has kind of been taken out of his hands to a degree at the end, but for a change, taken out of his hands to better match what he originally envisioned, rather than, or at least attempt to, rather than sand off the rough edges.
Yeah, I looked at an article that compared the two cuts and sort of said what was new and what was in the original and everything. And what was interesting is that the reconstructed cut isn't just longer, it's different in a lot of ways, right? So from what I understand, from what I looked at last night, that scene where there's the doctor, the German doctor who's got tattoos all over his body and his shirt's open and he kisses Lee Marvin. In the original cut, that doctor has his shirt buttoned up. He is, a normal doctor, and he does not kiss Lee Marvin. Like it's very different takes of things in the film as well. It seems like so. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of opportunity for that because it's a very kind of episodic kind of film, isn't it? It's very kind of. There's a quote that we talked about. I think all the way go back to Still Helmet that we pulled from one of his books earlier, which says war is long periods of boredom punctuated by small sharp moments of extreme violence, and that's kind of like the whole of this film. I mean, not that boring is boring, but like that the whole structure is you've got this this squad. There are 4 members, the 4 horsemen. They're the ones who sort of survive the whole thing. And then in and out of that pops and all these replacements and kind of enlisted or conscripted men or whatever who come in, do their piece, get killed. We'll move on to the next one. And they kind of, it's sometimes they're sitting around just sort of shooting the shit and taking the piss out of each other. Sometimes they're just walking and all of a sudden they get into a firefight. Other times they're interacting with locals, but you kind of drop in with them for an hour or so and then cut away and they've walked for 6 weeks and you're in a different place entirely and something else is going on. So it's got this really kind of episodic structure to it.
Yeah, it's something that I think the best war movies capture that he does, which is like you say, that kind of the long periods of kind of nothing happens, as you'd say, sort of plot related, where men sit around the fire and they sort of tell stories, they talk to each other. That was something that, because I watched recently the 2 major versions. I know there's also like a 70s version, but the 2 most famous versions currently of All Quiet on the Western Front. And the thing that's interesting in the 30s one that won Best Picture is you get those scenes, right? You get those scenes where people just sit around talking about food they like or about wanting to go home and marry a girl or whatever it is. They have those downtime moments. Whereas the new one, the German one that's nominated for Best Picture this year, kind of doesn't do any of that. It goes from kind of important event to important event and battle to people discussing treaties to generals making mistakes and that kind of thing. It's all kind of big. And I feel like when you go quite big with a war movie and you just go to the battles and the generals making the decisions and stuff, you lose a lot of the humanity and a lot of what actually I think the experience was probably like based on things.
Yeah.
I think other films that do it well, because I only recently saw Oliver Stone's Platoon, actually. That was a big kind of blind spot for me. I'd never seen it. And that similarly has that, right? You get that stuff of of soldiers walking through the jungle. They're just talking. They're, you know, and then suddenly something might happen, but there's those long periods of really doing nothing at all. And I think this captures that really well. And I'm interested. I'd be interested to see the theatrical cut if a lot of that gets sacrificed, as I suspect it probably does. But definitely in this reconstructed version, the majority of the film is those moments, really, isn't it? And that's not to say there aren't really great action scenes in it, but it isn't about that for the most part.
And it's also, you know, it's a film that's quite relatively free of the sort of histrionics you get in a lot of these sort of films. There's very few. I mean, there are moments of kind of like, you know, sort of, you know, truth bombs are dropped, if you like, but there's no big swelling kind of rousing nature. It's sort of people making observations, and not everybody in the scene like noticing the observations and things like that. It's just people sort of quietly talking to each other most of the time. And I don't know about you, I found it fascinating from sort of several different points of view, because like right from the off you get there's lots of Fullerisms in it, but it seems to be like the bombast, but it seems to be kind of sanded down to the point where, I don't know, it's kind of like kind of speaks louder through speaking more quietly, if you know what I mean. But anyway, what I'm trying to get to is there's this really interesting thing about it being made at 1980 is that some of the dialogue and some of the kind of you're right, Arthur. Some of the dialogue and the way it's written feels very kind of 50s at times, but at the same time you've got almost like a new Hollywood aesthetic and a new Hollywood sort of style of performance to some of the actors as well. And then you've got Lee Marvin, and it feels like this sort of transitional period film between the two styles. Do you know what I mean?
I know what you mean, because it's Mark Hamill in the middle of Star Wars, right? Like in a kind of era where Empire Strikes Back's probably either just come out or hasn't come out yet. So we're sort of still at that period where like new Hollywood's kind of come and gone, and blockbusters are now sort of taking over, and we're probably going to get, you know, into the 80s with all the kind of kids films and family films and franchises and stuff starting. Yeah, it is.
And you've got a man who hasn't made a Hollywood film in 10 years from more or less the start of New Hollywood.
Yeah.
It's kind of New Hollywood, like you say, is come and gone. He's sort of jumped out at the end of the old studio system and transported himself to 1980, and all of a sudden you've got this kind of strange sort of transitional, slightly throwback but slightly modernist film, and it's got this weird film out of time quality to it that's actually really quite compelling as well. It kind of it keeps you on your toes a little bit, and one of the things that kind of, I don't know, it's a strange intangible quality, but one of the things that kind of adds to it is the casting of Lee Marvin. Now I haven't watched a lot of Lee Marvin films. I don't really remember a lot of Marvin's films, but he's so good in this. Like, he's so sort of, he's, I don't know, like I say, I've not watched a lot, but my assumption was always it'd be a bit more sort of brash and kind of I thought it'd be more, a lot more brash, but actually he's got this very sort of quiet, reserved, kind of thoughtful, observed kind of nature to him. That's kind of, there's a reassurance to his presence as a sergeant, but actually he's also got this side to him where, like when the Sicilian girl puts flowers in his helmet, you know, he's not the sort of Griff John Wayne character who goes, you know, can't wear this shit. He's like, no, this girl's grateful she's done this for me. I'm gonna be the big tough war sergeant, but I'm gonna wear my helmet that's now decorated with flowers, and I'm gonna wear it out onto the battlefield because it's a nice thing to do for her. And there's this quality to his character and his performance I really, really liked.
Yeah, he kind of, because I've seen quite a few Lee Marvin films, and he usually does play that sort of strong silent type sort of figure in the ones I've seen, at least. And yeah, there is a quality to him in this where he's like he is a kind of a classic Fuller protagonist. You can imagine him being, I don't mean that in a bad way, because if you've watched all of these so far, you know that I don't often like a lot of the Fuller protagonists, but I mean he harking more back to like Steel Helmet. What's the name of the star of that? Gene something?
Gene Evans.
Gene Evans. I feel like this is more like the kind of, he's got like an upgraded Gene Evans in Lee Marvin.
Yeah, I was going to say not to denigrate Gene Evans at all, but it's a bit like that scene in Wayne's World 2 where they replace the gas station attendant with Charlton Heston. Mike Myers is like, come on, like I know it's only a small part, but we can do better than this. And they wheel him out and bring Charlton Heston on for 30 seconds. But yeah, that's what it feels like. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, speaking of the Fullerisms, because like you're right, it is kind of less full of that. Like Fuller films often feel very written, right? Like there's a very like writerly quality to them where he's got a very distinctive voice and he has people say these kind of particular kind of like cynical, hard-bitten sort of things that they say to each other. Real like movie dialogue in a kind of a tough, you know, robust movie dialogue way. And there's a little bit of it in this, like the line like "we don't murder, we kill" is a very Sam Fuller line, I think. But you're right, it is less full of that. And I think one of the ways that's less full of it, to kind of be all over the shop in terms of where we're talking about in the film, is much like Fuller's War, as I understand it, this one culminates with them liberating a concentration camp, and that sequence is played basically without any dialogue for like 20 minutes or something, right? Like, so he definitely does know when to just completely turn that down. It's not filmed in like stylized silence, like it's still got ambient noise. It's just that people aren't talking, which is a really good choice because I think it's very easy for someone who wasn't there to write reactions for people being in a death camp, like kind of going in and being like, oh God, those monsters, look at these bastards and what they've done. But I guess if you're someone who was there, words don't really necessarily do the experience you had in that place justice or reflect.
Yeah, and you know, this is stuff that not only does he remember it, but you know, he shot the footage, didn't he? The footage that's been used like across the world in newsreels, probably, I don't know, but possibly played at
Nuremberg
and things like that. That's, he's not just, you know, he's not just been there and sort of, I mean, he has been there and he was there and he liberated it, but he's the one who's kind of turned the camera on and witnessed it to the world as well. So there's a strange, that's a strange thing to carry. It must be quite a unique thing to carry. And you know, that whole sequence as well. Like you said, I mean, one of the things is this is 2.5 hour movie, and we always talk about these being 80 minutes. And I wonder if having a little bit more breathing room between each kind of bit of bombastic kind of just helps even it out a little bit. But that sequence as well, I believe I've remembered this right, but that sequence was actually shot in Israel, because a lot of they shot most of it in Israel or Ireland, and he was talking about the kind of the conversations that they had to have with the sort of authorities to get the place and to set dress it, and kind of like the sensitive. It was talking about the sensitivity needed basically to do that in that place, and not and be respectful basically. So there's a level there as well when you think about some of the stuff where he's gone, yeah, we're going to shoot this, shoot that. There's a level of thought that seems to have gone into this production that I'm not saying he didn't do in his other productions, but he doesn't take the time to talk about in his other productions. So it seems like it's a very it's a film that's been kind of very carefully and meticulously planned, I think, and over the course of sort of 40 years or so, like really.
Yeah. It also has at the same time, there's a certain slapdash quality to a lot of Fuller's work, where there's a certain lack of care for detail at times. And I just bring up because it is a counterpoint to sort of what you were saying there. Just like there's a bit at the beginning where one of the nice things structurally in the film, I guess mirroring his war experience, is you see the Big Red One from the beginning of American engagement in the war, like in 1942. go to North Africa, go to Sicily. Kind of, you see them go through these kind of different campaigns. It's kind of structured in this way, and it involves D-Day and Germany and all of this. One of the things that happens at the beginning when they go onto the beach in North Africa is they encounter Vichy French resistance. Not the French resistance to their landing by the Vichy French. Yeah. And I found it kind of funny because he has the landing craft announce in French that they shouldn't shoot because the Americans are here and they don't want to fight the French. So the speaker says to them in French not to do that. And then the French themselves talk to each other in English, which is weird. It's like you could just announce everything in English and we just suspend our disbelief that French doesn't really exist in this world. Or you have the French just say to each other stuff in French, but the French are talking like, one of the French is like, oh, hold your fire. And it's just like, but you were just being spoken to in French.
Yeah,
anyway, it really doesn't matter. But it's just one of those things where it's like Fuller. The only way I can really put it is, and we've talked about this before on this sequence, Fuller just doesn't give a shit about stuff like that. He just doesn't give a shit, and there is something kind of fun and refreshing about that, I guess, as well. Like, this is the thing, is that like a lot of us who like films were kind of nerds. Fuller is not a nerd. Like, I feel like if you say to Fuller, that scene where they all speak French and the French don't speak French, what's that about? It'd be like, what? Shut up, nerd. Who cares? That's the vibe I get.
There's definitely an element of that. He just wants to tell his story as quickly as possible, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, and also, you know, like, does anyone really know the rules for any of that? Like, who speaks what, when, and what accents you're allowed to use, and like, if it's speaking in another language but we're hearing it in English, it doesn't matter if everybody talks with completely different. I don't know the rules.
Yeah,
just go with it. But yeah, I know what you mean. But also, that's an odd scene as well, because it probably feels like the most contrived scene in the whole film. But it's, again, you know, it's based on stuff that he's written about in his autobiography. Yeah.
It's something I said to you while watching it in a message, which is just like, and it's almost Herzogian in a way. Like, you know, the way that Werner Herzog has this stuff in his fictional work, but also very much in his documentary, where he's interested in, a bit like Fuller, he's got a kind of tough, maybe slightly cynical man's man sort of view of the world and of things. But within that framework, he sees a lot of room for just like weirdness and people being very odd. And it's like, I said to you while I was watching it, I sent you a message saying, there's loads of stuff in this movie where something weird happens, and those are the bits where I just assume that literally happened to Sam Fuller. Because, like, there's a bit at the end of where they're fighting the Vichy French, and Vichy French people kill their mates, they kill Vichy French troops, and then as soon as somebody's like, oh, we will fight with you, we surrender, the troops will just get up and spontaneously run together and hug. And I'm thinking, like, you were just shooting each other. But then I'm also thinking, like, maybe that's what fucking happened. And it's the same. There's a bit later where a landmine blows up a guy's balls, and Lee Marvin tells him, "Oh, that mine is supposed to, you know, take your cock off or whatever." And then he reaches down, all bloody, and finds that it hasn't taken his penis off, and he just starts shouting like, "I still got my cock," over and over again. And it's like, again, it's one of those moments where it's like, if you didn't know this was like Sam Fuller, he's been there, you would just think like, you know, why Steven Spielberg had somebody in Saving Private Ryan shouting, "I've still got my cock"? That's very strange. But you just kind of see it in the context of Sam Fuller, and you're just like, yeah, I bet that just fucking happened. That exact thing, just probably he saw that. Is that true?
Yeah, it's in the book. It's really experienced watching it, because obviously reading the book for this, I've got a lot of the stories, and they've obviously come back round, and maybe it's because they're in his head from where he's written the script, or they're the key ones. But I watched Clerks 3 recently.
Similar film.
Well, no, in as much as, like, if you listen to Kevin Smith talk or do his podcast or anything, he's spoken at length about his experience with his heart attack,
right?
And just about all of that makes it into Clerks 3. Like, you're like, oh yeah, he's talked about that. So as I was watching it, like, the kind of the suspension disbelief in some of those moments, because, you know, the acting's great, but it is at its ropiest in that Vichy scene. and I was thinking, and that kind of pulled me through. That was the only time really, because I was a little bit kind of, like I say, I wasn't quite sure what we were getting, but once you get past that scene, it was like, oh no, I'm in safe hands. But yeah, all of it, I seem to be very, very familiar. It's been about a year since I read that part of the book, but
Yeah.
but yeah, it's all comes from, as far as I can tell, apart from, I think the opening with the horse is part of like an image he had in his head, or a dream or something like that, that he's kept with. But apart from that, it seems to all be based on stuff he's written about in his biography.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I had a similar thing recently watching The Fabelmans, because obviously that's kind of scene for scene based on things that you know about Spielberg's childhood or stories he's told. And it was a similar thing for me watching it, because I do know so much of that story from documentaries about Spielberg and things like that. Watching it, and then when something slightly strange happens, that maybe someone that doesn't know that story would be like, why do they have a monkey now? You know, it's just like, that just happened to Spielberg. That's just what his mum did. You know, it's kind of, yeah, it does add this kind of weird layer to it when you're watching it. What was I going to say? What I was going to say, because you mentioned earlier about that lack of, I can't remember the words you used, but you kind of spoke to that lack of any, like, you know, heroism, any lack of that sort of
yeah.
What were you talking about? Sort of that there's not that bombastic sort of sense of like great men doing great deeds, or the
I can't remember. I can't remember if this. I think this might be in the film, but I don't know if because obviously there's crossover between the film itself, the documentary that's on the DVD, and the book. But and I've also just watched The Typewriter, the Rifle, and the Movie Camera. But he talks about the real glory of war being surviving. That there is no real kind of, it's all madness, and none of it really makes any sense. It's just killing, and the only thing that really matters in the end is surviving. So that's kind of at the heart of it. There isn't, like, even the scene with what's it called, that big sort of pipe bomb thing, where they're trying
to
like
Bangalore torpedo, I think it's
Bangalore torpedo. So they've landed on Omaha. They're trying to break through the barbed wire. So it's their Saving Private Ryan scene, if you like. And they're all pinned down, and they've been there for hours. There's this nice kind of
that watch thing's great.
Yeah, and that's an image actual image from his experience on D-Day that he just remembered. There's this watch, this dead guy, and he's in the surf, and you see the time on his watch keep coming back to it, and then the water's getting progressively bloodier, and you can see the time each. But anyway, they're all pinned back, and they've been there for hours, and all the bazooka teams are dead and everything, and they've got this Bangalore thingy that's basically like a tube of TNT that they're going to use to break through and get past the defenses. But it needs assembling, and it needs taking over to underneath where the defenses are, and then detonating from there. And they're just sending person after person. It's like, number one gets a couple of the sections, goes a little way, gets shot. Number two, and they go through. They get to like number 7. It's like number 7. Number 7's dead. Number 8, and it's like they just keep going. But it's not like it's really tense, because you're like, oh shit, are they going to do it? But it's not like there's this big sort of John Williams-y swell and kind of victoriousness to it. It just
feels futile and cruel, doesn't it? It just feels like you're just endlessly saving wave of men to go and die, really unceremoniously.
Yeah, and even that's unceremoniously, is exactly right. It's not got that kind of glory to it. And even like Lee Marvin, as who's doing it, is like, you know, it's like somebody like getting frustrated trying to like chain start but you know, trying to make something work. So, next one.
It's that thing, you get that earlier in the film, and I think this is something you've mentioned on previous episodes about sort of Fuller, and it's something you see in other war movies and some of Fuller's other war movies as well. This idea that the troops who've been there for a while kind of don't want to get to know any of the new troops because they've seen them all die. And you get scenes early on in this one where new troops are turning up, and the other troops are like, yeah, I mean, you'll be dead in a week because there's been loads of you. We're the only ones who've been here since the beginning, you know.
Yeah.
So I guess
enough, on the documentary they talk about the actors behaving like that as well. So the core group of actors basically not really being that friendly with anybody else, because are they only here to shoot for a week? You know, we're not going to invite them out. Bit of life thing out there. But also at the end of that scene, when they do break the defenses, there's no big like, hey, it's just like, oh, they've done it. Bring them up. Oh, yeah, we've punched a hole through the exit. Brilliant. Cut to 3 weeks later, and they're in Belgium.
You do get a rah-rah speech on the beach before they charge through. But even that speech from a guy saying that they got to charge through is one where he says, look, guys, there's only two types of men on this beach. People who are already dead and people who are going to die. So let's go.
Let's go die over there.
Yeah, even then it's like there is no sense that they're going to do some amazing thing. It seems futile. That's
a direct quote. That's a direct quote from somebody on the beach that he saw. But yeah, like you say, it's not a rah-rah. Let's go win for democracy and America. Yeah. It's like we're all fucked. Well, let's just do it anyway.
Yeah, the thing I was going to say about the lack of that sort of gung-ho-ness, that heroism, and that because the thing is, even with the best will in the world, this is one of the reasons I don't really like Band of Brothers that much, as much as it is a really well-made show, is that it's got that undercurrent of like the Greatest Generation, the noble sacrifice. Thank God these men did these things. And you know, to some extent that's true. It's good that people did stop Hitler, but at the same time, you are watching people do things that in the
Thank you for clarifying that, Rob.
Well, yeah, but you are at the same time watching people in the scheme of things. It's futility. It's man's inhumanity, man. It's just cruel for everybody involved. And there are some bits in this that you would not see in a more propagandistic sort of or celebratory sort of Greatest Generation war movie, where like Allied troops are cutting off ears of dead German soldiers to trade for things or to keep as trophies, or you've got like an American soldier who's talking about a rumor.
Like the edict comes down that they're not allowed to do it anymore because the ears might be American ears.
Yes, exactly. That's the reason they stopped. So they could be American ears, so don't do that. There's a bit where the and I don't know how true this is, but I have no doubt in my mind Fuller heard somebody say this, or this was a rumor. He says like, oh, have you heard about the other camp down the way? They're burying the wounded alive. And it's like, well, that's an American talking about other American soldiers. That's not a story that you would tell in a John Wayne movie about World War II, that the American troops would bury other American troops alive. I don't know how true that was. I guess it's possible that if they needed to move hurriedly and they didn't want to leave people just out, I guess that could have happened. It's not the sort of thing you would ever.
No, and this comes from
Saving Private Ryan.
I mean, this comes from also ideas about him like rejecting working on Patton because of his feelings towards the fact, because there's no geopolitics in it. There's like the soldiers don't really show much of an understanding of why they're fighting, or even any interest really.
Yeah,
like it's nothing to do with them. They've just got to sort of walk along and get into a fight every now and then and keep their heads down. And it is that sort of silent last 20 minutes at the camp where there is a kind of there's a reason is offered for it, even though that reason wasn't, it wasn't known about or kind of by those soldiers or anything like that, but they found a purpose to it in the end. But they don't say that, like they don't talk about it amongst each other. Like Mark Hamill, the only time you really see anyone having real sort of, they're quite stoic throughout the whole thing, and then Mark Hamill sort of losing his mind a little bit and repeatedly shooting the sort of the German prison officer who's hiding in one of the furnaces is kind of like, it's the only real time that anyone sort of emotionally kind of collapses. But it's all contained within this, like you say, this largely kind of dialogue free kind of, right, shit, well, this is what we're doing, and we've ended this, which is a good thing, but it's fucking horrible, and how are we going to cope with this from now on? So it's kind of, it does offer that as a kind of it does offer that as a kind of, I don't know, as a reason for it all, but it's not overly concerned with sort of rah-rah kind of we need to fight. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's really interesting. And also, like, it's really interesting. It's just really because he's just sort of there's a bit where he's just sort of standing, firing repeatedly into this furnace rhythmically, like at a kind of a really regular interval, and goes through his entire magazine. Lee Marvin eventually comes up to him, doesn't stop him, and I can't remember because I was sort of looking at it and kind of really taken with it. He kind of sort of helps him reload and go again, doesn't it? Rather than saying, he says, I think he's dead, but he doesn't like stop him or grab hold of him or try and calm him down. He just kind of like takes some of the empty shells and sort of leaves him to do a couple more shots before he finishes. Really kind of for a film that hasn't got much of that in it, it's used really effectively in one sort of short, sharp shock at the end.
Yeah, and I guess as well that does reflect the reality of turning up in those camps. That there are lots of stories about the liberation, the concentration camps, and you know, frankly, things that would be considered war crimes that American and British and soldiers did because they got them and were so horrified that they killed prisoners of war and things like that. So yeah, like I think that completely sells a lot of that stuff as well. It's there are a few things I wanted to point out that don't really fit into any sort of larger thematic thing. They're just like stray observations about it that I thought were interesting. We've talked a lot in previous episodes about how much Spielberg was a fan of his. A recap for those who've not listened to previous episodes, like Fuller is actually in 1941, isn't he? And Spielberg, I think, which was the Fuller film Spielberg said he had in his trunk that he showed Fuller. He had a big reel of in his. It was one of the earlier Fuller war films, wasn't it?
That I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, that he had
a surprising one. Was it like Fixed Bayonets or something?
It was
like
something.
That?
It was something. Yes, he had one of the earlier ones on a reel, and he said to Fuller on set, like, "Hey, look, I got this in my car." Like, clearly an influence, and we've spotted in some previous Fuller films moments and ideas and shots that maybe were inspirational to Spielberg. There's some of that here, I think, as well. If you consider just how reverent some of these guys were towards him, because the way Fuller shoots D-Day and the beaches is very reminiscent of what you get in Saving Private Ryan in a lot of
ways. And just on that point, just I mean, it's kind of not a massive observation, but like the budget and the pyrotechnics and the scale of this is kind of off the charts from what we've seen in his previous war films as well, obviously. But yeah, sorry, go on.
Well, no, I was just going to say, like, I know to some extent this could be coincidental because they're both basing it on the same facts, right? So they could just be doing things. You know, Fuller was there; he's basing it on his experience. Spielberg obviously looked at a lot of documentary stuff, talked to a lot of people who were there. But that whole aesthetic of those beaches with those big, hiding behind those big metal, I don't know what they're called, but you know what I mean? Those big metal
the sort of anti-landing.
Yeah, the anti-landing things, those kind of being kind of barricades, and some of the individual moments of seeing people take bullets and rolling their bodies over, or, you know, from hiding behind the sand, and all these little bits. There's lots of bits in that sequence that feel like bits that you've kind of seen then done in Saving Private Ryan. I think the main difference in that sequence, apart from that Spielberg's got an even bigger budget and is on an even bigger scale, is you get much more of a sense, because that bit with the watch, of boredom and time, even on D-Day, right? This kind of idea they've been hunkered down, unable to move for a long, long time as well, which is really interesting. But then you get some other things in there that are kind of Spielberg-y, like the opening of the film's in black and white, because it's Lee Marvin remembering himself fighting at the end of, like, his characters remembering fighting at the end of World War One on like Armistice Day. And there's one detail that's color, which is a red patch for the big red one. So that one detail in red in a black and white setting is obviously Schindler's List. You kind of get that later.
The interesting thing about that is that's in the script, but wasn't in the film until the reconstruction.
Yeah.
So it was always intended to be that way. But the actual theatrical cut that was available before Schindler's List was made was entirely in black and white, as I understand it.
Interesting. I wouldn't have put it past Spielberg to have read the script, but yeah, interesting. It could just be
the sort of thing they might have talked about, you know.
But... Yeah, true. And then you also get, and I don't know, because I often feel like Kubrick is his own thing in a vacuum sometimes, but like it reminded me of Full Metal Jacket. The bit where Fuller is Fuller plays like a war correspondent or like a soldier who's filming a load of stuff. And there's a scene where he's filming and he's kind of walking down the line, just filming loads of troops who are sitting down like against a wall. And that is basically, there's a scene in Full Metal Jacket that's the same, right, where you get this kind of camera.
Yeah, it doesn't happen considering this. They would have been filming at roughly the same time. Doesn't Coppola do that as well in Apocalypse Now?
Oh yeah, I think you're probably right.
Yeah.
So maybe it's just something in the air rather than influence. But it's there were just some interesting things I thought were in there, and I liked what were my other stray observation notes? Did you? Well, I've got some random ones here, like Evil Gay German. What do you think of Evil Gay German as a character? That seemed to be an odd thing. But again, it's one of those things where I guess that just happened. I guess maybe that happened.
What the guy, the doctor kissing him?
Yeah, it's so strange that's in the film.
It is, yeah.
I mean, modern lens, you can kind of watch it and be like, we again in isolation. If you don't know anything about Fuller or anything like that, you could just be kind of like, oh, this is like a weird homophobia. Of course, the Nazi is gay or something. But I'm guessing because of how autobiographical this is, maybe this fucking happened. Maybe there was a German doctor in North Africa who kissed some guy he knew when he was in, on a gurney somewhere. There
are several there are a few references to sort of men being on their own for long periods of time without women and getting horny. And Lee Marvin's kind of reaction to it is really. John Wayne does not give the same reaction to. What does he say?
Yeah.
He kind of just sort of he gets kissed and then kind of.
He says he's got bad breath, doesn't he?
Yeah, he says, I can understand you being horny, Fritz, but you've got really bad breath. So there's this kind of reaction to it that's like, there's no sort of gay panic about the reaction or about the action itself. But yeah, it's an odd moment. It is an odd moment. One that I don't feel fully qualified to
unpack. Yeah, I don't really know.
That was the weird thing. The reaction kind of diffused any sort of gay panic about it to me, or kind of I thought there was a few moments like that where it kind of the film hints towards sort of intimacy, and I thought there was an undercurrent of that anyway, but yeah, it's a very strange moment.
There's a bit I really liked, just speaking of like stray observations in the film, there's a bit I really like where there's this Italian kid who's lost his parents. He's got his mum's dead body in a kind of a donkey-drawn carriage, I guess. And he's got his decomposing mother's body, and he wants them to help him bury his mum. But they don't have time to help him. They want to find this gun. And the kid's like, well, I know where the gun is, and I can help you find the gun if you help me bury my mum. Basically, that's the scene. While the translator is talking Italian to the boy, and the boy's talking Italian to the translator, this gun that they need to take down is like shelling constantly. And I thought it was a really nice detail that the actor who is talking to the boy, presumably this was directed by Fuller, this element of the performance, the whole time he's talking in Italian and translating for Lee Marvin and talking to the boy, he's constantly looking up. Like his eyes are looking up every time, like subtly, not like looking up with his whole head, but his eyes keep looking up every time there's like the sound of a shell. And it made me think that that's one of those things that would have been like an important detail to someone who had been there. Like, I can almost imagine the actor doing a first take where he's just talking to the boy in Italian and Fuller being like, what are you doing? You're always looking up when those shells are going off. When you're there, like you never stop, trying to, see if the shell's above you, or, you know what I mean? It just felt like a really lived in detail of being there, especially because of the way sort of films are made, there probably wasn't, that close-up of that man probably wasn't corresponding directly to a shell being fired or even a sound of it. So it's a very directed sort of like cool detail that is clearly from someone who knows what, the situation's like, I think.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Funny enough as well, I mean, this is by the by, like it's not directly connected to what you were just saying, but again, in the documentary I watched about the reconstruction, that's one of the scenes that was slightly re-altered. Because in the original theatrical cut, the boy sort of goes missing. So they were talking about how when they go to see where the gun is, they've kind of digitally added in a few frames. Like it's interpolated frames that weren't originally there. So this is like, we're talking 20 years ago. They're starting to add in.
Yeah.
So but yeah, that was just to make sure that the boy was there and didn't go missing. But yeah, I thought that was they were doing that 20 years ago for this, weren't they?
Yeah, that's
in terms of the reconstruction, it wasn't just putting whole scenes in; they were tweaking little bits and pieces here, there.
Yeah,
well.
Lucasing it. It's the special edition of
special edition,
of Big Red One. So yeah, I really liked it overall. Like I do think that it is the best of his war movies, and that is a claim because his war movies are probably some of his best movies. I think this really does live up to the billing. I'm a big fan of Steel Helmet, and I think this probably is one up. What's your sort of take on it overall?
I was so massively impressed by it. And I could see it just kind of, like you said, it's the lack of histrionics. It's just such a well-observed kind of lived in. We talked about his films feeling lived in before and coming from a place of truth. It just feels so sort of natural that there is a level of realism to it that you don't often always find with other films that are much more, something like Thin Red Line, which has got a similarly long kind of episodic structure. That sort of Malick kind of ponderous sensibility to it. There's an authenticity to the rawness of this, where the kind of the more highfalutin kind of lyrical version of it with animals slithering through glass, and this kind of gets to a sense of it that I feel that those sort of films miss. Do you know what I mean? I found it really, really compelling, and we were like, so he's earned a 3.5-3 hour film after all the short ones we've watched.
Yeah,
it flies by. Like, it's the short, sharp, episodic nature of it. Like keeps it ticking over. Really, I could done without less of the less of the kind of German sergeant who's counterpoint to Lee Marvin, who's often in sort of, who's obviously in conflict with him, but often says the same things or thinks the same things. That point was made a few too many times. But there's just some stuff in here that's just sort of like, in terms of set piece filmmaking and scene by scene, like the whole tank sequence, from scouting the kind of the German tank with the people playing possum, and sort of having to silently kill the Germans in the tank so as not to wake up, or so as not to alert all the ones that are pretending to be dead on the floor. From going from that into like this sidecar just all of a sudden comes out of nowhere. The motorcyclist comes off and dies. His wife's giving birth and they have to get her into the tank and use bullets as stirrups to deliver this baby, and the guy's fumbling around with condoms over his fingers to like create gloves, and they pull cheesecloth off a bit of cheese to give him a mask, and they sort of deliver this baby in a tank. It's incredible sequencing, and you're like, this is, that is along some of the sort of best things I've seen in any war movie. That sequence in particular.
Yeah, it's again one of those bits that's so strange it probably happened as well.
Yeah, he writes about it. I think it happens slightly differently in the. I think he's relocated it into the tank, and for the that kind of imagery kind of does it, but it definitely happened. I think it was. If I might be misremembering what I read because it was a while ago, but I think it was sort of like just on a country road in Belgium, and he's put it in the tank. But it did happen, yeah. And also, there's just the way that they all allow themselves this moment of like proper joy and kind of like a genuine like win in that tank as the baby's being delivered, in a way that the film doesn't give them when they win a. They don't feel it when they win a battle, and they certainly don't feel it when they liberate the camp.
Yeah.
But this is like they get a moment to like live basically, or you know, or the other time when they actually feel they talk about feeling happy for an hour is after they kind of liberate that Sicilian village and all the women come out and they cook them a huge feast and the kids are out playing and they you know they the sort of the moments of victory aren't, none of them are battle related. Well, that is sort of battle related, but it's not. It's the interactions with people rather than the we've killed all these people or we've destroyed this. It's really, really lovely. That scene in particular, I think, is really, really probably, you know, the best out of any Fuller we've seen, I think.
Yeah, there's a kind of a Seven Samurai moment. You know, there's that bit in Seven Samurai where they capture one of the bandits, and the samurai are like, "Don't kill the bandit. That's not a good thing to do." And then the old woman comes out with the big like hoe or whatever it is, and they're just like, "All right, leave it to it." And she just murders the guy with the hoe.
Yeah,
with the old women come down from the big sides, and they just start hacking at a German soldier who's on the ground. But yeah, it's. The other thing is, I don't know if cool is the best word to use because I do not feel like Fuller wants this to be cool or that he thinks violence or World War II are cool. So I don't want to say cool, but the action sequences in this film are also just really well done. They are exciting, tense action sequences. Like I said it in my Letterboxd review, Lee Marvin is the stabbiest man in the history of World War II movies. He must stab. I don't know what his stab count in this film is, but he stabs a lot of guys, and he's always stabbing them by, I guess, like stabbing them in the lungs and covering their mouths so they can't make a sound. And he does a lot of that. And there's some sequence where they're all in like a cave, and he's like silently killing people.
Yeah, it becomes farcical when they're hiding them.
Yeah, they're hiding all the bodies, and then they end up sort of just fighting all these guys in this cave. When the German tanks are going along, are they like crushing people's heads?
I think so.
You get this like shouting like ah! The German tank, the kind of the tracks go over the heads of people who are hiding in the ground, and yeah, there's lots of quite visceral stuff. There's lots of really well done. Oh, another thing I was going to say was a bit like Saving Private Ryan on the D-Day scene. Was there's a bit where a guy takes a cigar from a dead guy's jacket, and his guts are just like completely out, like it's like his intestines and his bowels and stuff.
Well, like the bit with the guys where he gets his sort of gonads blown up as well. That's pretty graphic, you know. He's like,
yeah,
it's like you see a
fleshy testicle.
Yeah,
yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of that stuff is really well done. I hesitate to say it's like exciting and cool, but it is. They are very well done. World War II on.
Yeah, I mean it's over the course of a 3-hour film. It's sparse, and it's used effectively at the right moment. You know, it's not like you think about. Go back to Saving Private Ryan, which I really like. There is I've used that. I often use that scene in class when talking about sound design and things like that. But there are a lot of people. There are a lot of amputees. There's a lot of viscera in that scene. And although there's not, you could never accuse this film of being sort of bloodless, but it's not. It's never sort of excessive. You know, it is crunchy, but it's not. It uses those bits. It uses the guy with the open stomach or the testicle. It uses these things very infrequently, but to great effect when they do. And the scale of it is really good. Like, you know, like that was one of the scenes actually. The kind of the French cavalry in the amphitheater, that battle sequence was something that was originally cut. Strange things it's not like they've added. When we were talking on Signal before we did this, we were like speculating whether or not it was the German storyline that had been cut, but actually it was seemed much more ramshackle than that.
Yeah, which is surprising because I agree with you. The stuff with the German is the stuff I think you could cut, and I think one of the reasons why is that everything in the film feels quite authentic. Apart from that, because everything is like Fuller's experience and things he saw,
and that's speculation.
And that's kind of speculation. and it's also very cartoonish. Like, it's this German officer who will machine gun anyone he meets who says Hitler's bad, which just, I'm sure is not necessarily the reality of like being an officer in the Wehrmacht or whatever it is, right? Like, so it kind of rings false in those sequences. But
although the upshot of it is you do get him hiding behind that cross in the tank scene, which is really lovely element to that scene. I mean, I don't know if you need to cut back to him as many times as you do to establish him, to get him in that scene. But I think a certain amount of work of him is worth it for that, I think.
Yeah. The idea, because that cross features at the start of the film in the black and white sequence, because it's this cross, I guess, in France, right, where Lee Marvin's characters also fought in World War One, and the idea of the same guy ending up on the same battlefield that he fought in the previous war, and going to that battlefield and there being a memorial up for all of the troops who died in the last war, like a World War One memorial on the battleground of a World War Two battlefield, is just a really nice idea. Like, in terms of, I mean, I'm sure that just happened. I'm sure they came across stuff like that. But that idea of, like, I don't know, to me that punctures again that kind of heroism and bombast, right? Because you're sort of like, oh yeah, look, here's the last statue they put up to say, oh, remember the dead, and let's not do this again, everyone. And here we are doing it again. And the kind of idea that this old guy is, as lots of people of a certain generation did, fought in both the wars as well, which is just always an interesting and scary concept.
Yeah, but like you say, I think this film speaks to a lot of the kind of personal kind of politics and ideology of Fuller, obviously, because it's so autobiographical. But it's like you say, these things happen, but he's selected them and he's thought about them and he's meditated on it all for years and years and years, and he chooses to speak about the experience of combat and serving without too much comment on the geopolitics of it all, and that's the film's strength, I think, is that it is the war film from the point of view of the lowest people on the rung, and there's films that like aspire to do that, I guess, but always with a little bit of sort of bombast and kind of bit of sort of patriotism on it, just to sort of make it more palatable, and that's always been that's like a defining feature of Sam Fuller's films, is he doesn't care if things are palatable or not. He just wants to tell you what he thinks, and it all comes together really beautifully in this film. I think this is kind of it is, to me, it is sort of like the absolute apex of his powers as a filmmaker. There's not necessarily, there might be things that might be more representative of his faults, and a kind of his kind of all-round filmography. There might be films that are slightly more representative of his sort of general filmmaking prowess, but this is like everything is just sort of at the top of its game for him, and it's a really, really good film.
Yeah, no, I agree. Is there, before we wrap up, I know you did watch some of those documentaries and read the book. Is there anything else from any of that you wanted to sort of mention?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few bits. There's loads. It's difficult to remember what we did and what we didn't. I like the fact that the sniper, the Nazi youth sniper thing was something that was cut, that came back in. And I like that. I like the sequence of them going, well, we should kill him, and then he goes around the squad and says, right, you do it, you do it, you do it, and then in the end just sort of spanks him until he it's just so absurd. What else? I'm trying to think what else was in there. There was lots of sort of story. Peter Bogdanovich was a big part of getting this done.
Oh, cool.
It's at a time just before he not long before he actually leaves America. He makes Black Dog next, and then there's a reaction to that, and that's when he leaves for Europe permanently. But Bogdanovich is part of this. Coppola is, involved in that. He wanted for a little while to get Scorsese to play which one? The Robert Carradine role. What else? There was a few. There was some other bits and pieces of trivia. Really, like he's kind of, before this. There was just a few interesting stories about films that did and didn't get made, or started to get made and fell through. He talks about sort of friendship with Jim Morrison for a film that didn't get made, and Jim Morrison kind of wanting to be in one of his films. Talks about striking up a friendship with Fassbinder after making Dead Pigeon on Beethoven Street, and kind of wanting to cast Fassbinder in something. But yeah, it goes through, like I say, there's this period of things not quite getting off the ground, and then thanks to Bogdanovich and some others, this is where he finally gets the opportunity to make this. But also at the same time, it starts at a budget of 12 million and kind of gets narrowed down to about 4 million things. So it's interesting. I don't know.
Anything about just very frivolous question. Just anything in there about how he ended up having Mark Hamill in the film? Because Mark Hamill famously never really made it as a big star outside of being in Star Wars. Obviously, he's had a successful career in voice acting and all of that. This is one of the few big movies that has Mark Hamill in it. Was that a studio thing of, hey, we'll get this Hamill kid who's in Star Wars, or did he choose Mark Hamill? Is anything about the Hamill aspect, or does he just not?
He does a little bit, yeah. Like Mark Hamill didn't want to be in it originally, and then he meets with Sam Fuller and kind of gets mesmerized by him a little bit. George Lucas suggests him as well, and sort of talks to him about it. It seems like at the beginning, like neither of them were particularly keen on the other one, but they sort of come to. There wasn't a huge story about Mark Hamill in there at all, really, but it just seemed like it was an odd. I think it's odd because, I mean, can you think of any other Mark Hamill films where he's in something that isn't like a Batman animated film or a cameo in something? There's not a lot of films sort of serious.
No, there aren't. I mean, there's one called, like, what is it, like The Last Starfighter? I've never seen it.
Oh, The Last Starfighter is the one about the this video game that's a recruitment secret recruitment tool for an intergalactic war.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very on brand.
Okay, yeah, no, there isn't really, is there? There's a weird TV movie I saw years and years ago where he wasn't very good in it either. I can't even remember what it's called now, but yeah, he's not in a lot of stuff. He is in Britannia Hospital. I've just been reminded by Letterboxd, which is 82. So there is like a weird sort of period, I guess, around this time where he's occasionally, because Star Wars is still a going concern, getting these parts. But yeah, interesting. I was actually really curious about him being in it because, again, while I really have, he's been genuinely very good as a voice actor, but there was always this thing, even for me as a kid watching the original Star Wars, thinking that Mark Hamill was somewhat of a weak link as an actor in that film. There's definitely bits in the original Star Wars trilogy where, he's a bit whiny or a bit hammy, and I was watching this originally thinking like, oh, I wonder if I'm going to see like if he actually really pulls his weight. And actually, the character he plays called Griff. There's always a Griff in these Fuller movies. You haven't mentioned it. The character he plays doesn't really have to give a lot of range, right? Like there are bits where he's the character who's quite like shell shocked and stuff, and he's the one who's questioning whether he wants to kill. But those things are not, they're not like huge emotional scenes, are they? They're kind of somebody getting more numb.
Not until the end. He gets the big grandstand finish, doesn't he?
Yeah.
How do you think he pulled that off?
I don't know. Well, that's the thing I'm saying. It's like I don't undersell it as a moment. I'm not an actor, and I don't know. Maybe that's harder than it looks. But like, I think the thing is that moment's carried a lot by the circumstances and the situation and all of that. More, I would say, than the the reaction on Mark Hamill's face. But I don't know. Maybe I'm being unfair. It's I think he was good in the film. I think he was fine, but it wasn't like I was wondering if this was going to be like. Do you remember, for a similar comparison? Do you remember in the middle of the Star Wars prequel trilogy coming out, Hayden Christensen was in that film Shattered Glass, and that was one of going like, oh, he's actually good in that. I wondered if this would be the original Star Wars trilogy's version of that. People like, oh, Mark, you think Mark Hamill can't act? You should see Big Red One. He's amazing. I didn't think it was exactly that, but yeah, he's fine in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. So I'm looking forward to White Dog. As I said earlier, it's the last like proper Fuller, isn't it? Because the last three, if I'm going purely off judging a book by its cover territory here, but the posters on Letterboxd make it look like they're TV movies or really obscure movies no one ever watched.
Yeah, there's what you'll tell me what this is from the description because I haven't got Letterboxd open, but there's one of them posters looks like it came bundled with 98, 99 other DVDs in 2006.
Yeah. Is that the one with Jennifer Beals, the Madonna and the Dragon? It's got a pound store DVD cover, isn't it?
Yeah, but not even just a single DVD. It's in a single box with 6 other films.
Yeah. So yeah, they look a bit. They look like they could be a bit ropey. White Dog is co-written by Curtis Hanson, and
yes.
So also, I think it's interesting because it's a very Fuller theme. That what the Letterboxd says about it is its trainer attempts to retrain a vicious dog that's been raised to kill black people, and I feel like there's a theme in his work. Not just a kind of a virulent anti-racist theme that he's had through early films like Steel Helmet and through Crimson Kimono and others, where he's kind of always been a little bit more progressive in that respect than a lot of his contemporaries. But also in Verboten, there's that whole idea in Verboten of actually trying to understand the Germans and trying to work out like where that intolerance came from. And I guess this whole idea, I've never seen White Dog. I might be wrong about what it's like, but from that description, it sounds like some of the idea might be about whether prejudice is learned, ingrained. Can you stop being prejudiced? Can you become unracist? It sounds like an interesting idea, and it sounds like a very Fuller kind of idea. You're smiling in a way that suggests you might think I'm talking bollocks, but I don't.
No, completely agree with you. I remember White Dog was one of the few films, because Big Red One wasn't available. When I first watched Sam Fuller at uni and bought a VHS, NTSC VHS off of eBay to be able to rewatch it for an essay. White Dog was the only one that in the days of before I properly started using sort of the internet effectively, the only one you could find in your sort of Time Out film guides or whatever, the only one I'd find many references to was White Dog.
Okay.
So I've got a memory. It was on Netflix for a while, bizarrely enough.
Okay.
And I've got a memory of starting it and having to do something else, and I came back to watch it and been taken off. But it was one of the most surprising films on. I think there was that film White God.
Okay.
Do you remember that?
No.
There was a film from about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, that was about dogs. That was seen to be 2014 Hungarian drama. Going right off on a tangent here. Film follows the mixed breed dog Hagen. He befriends a 13-year-old Lil, and then the dogs take over. But yeah, it was clearly, the name was clearly inspired by White Dogs. White, anyway.
Interesting. Okay.
But
so I'm looking forward to that one. So hopefully we'll get to doing that much quicker than we got to doing this one, probably in a few weeks' time. But yeah, I've really enjoyed talking about Big Red One. I'm really happy to have finally seen it. I'm hoping that we'll get to talk about White Dog soon as we continue on our path to obtain a fuller understanding. Thank you, everybody, and see you on the next